Hello, and welcome for the lesson for Chapter 4 for the Giver. Once again, for Chapters 4 and 5, we're going to be completing a gathering evidence worksheet. And those two chapters are on the same worksheet. You should have either received it in class or you may be taking a look at it through Teams. So let's take a look at this worksheet again. It's very similar to what we had for Chapter 1, whereas in the beginning, we see all of these questions in bold. Then there's these directions that ask, what will you be gathering evidence about? Underline the focusing question, etc. What I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust this just a little bit because only question 1 deals with chapter 4. So in the video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have us focus on just the information for chapter 4. And then when we come back for chapter 5, we'll take a look at that. So once again, in the beginning here, we are not writing out an answer yet. So let's take a look at what question 1 says, and then we're going to think about it and pick out the focusing question, the key words. And once again, it says it differently on there, the keywords that we want to find. So question 1 says, the concept of being released from the community is introduced on page 2, described briefly in the last paragraph on page 7 onto page 8, and discussed about in reference to the release of Roberto on page 31. Reread these excerpts and make a claim regarding what being released from the community means. So let's look through this. What are the key things that we are going to have to do? So underline key words in the focusing questions in the assignment above. So once again, I'm going to get out my highlighter. And our focus is on this idea of being released. We're going to go back to what we've already read. I'm not going to highlight that part of it. It does tell us to reread them. The main thing you're being asked to do is make a claim. And you're going to tell me what being released from the community means. Okay. All right, let's take a look at direction 2. So I'm going to turn my highlighter off just to make sure. We'll go down here to the directions. What information will you need to be able to answer the guiding question to explain your answer? If we are in class, I want you to turn to your partner and go through the chart again, just like we did with chapter 1, looking carefully at the organizer as you discuss the answers to the following questions, and you'll bubble in. So once again, you are not writing anything down. You are talking, verbalizing where that information goes. If you're not in the classroom, then just bear with me in the video. If you're in the classroom, you're going to pause it. So you have these 5 questions again to answer. Here is the chart on the back. What information will you put in the first 2 columns? And where will you get this information? Those 2 go together. First 2, once again, we have detail/evidence and page. In this first column, even though we see that I have typed something in there, quote about release, quote about release, quote about Roberto's release, you will put the detail or evidence in this box. Put the quote, the exact words from the book in this box. Now, I want to remind you, it does not have to be dialogue. Taking the words from the book, they are not yours. That makes it a quote. You need to give credit where credit is due. Page number, the page you found the quote on. So where would this information come from? The quote from the book and the page number the quote was found on. It comes from of course, the book. The next 2, what information will go in the 3rd column? Where will this information come from? The 3rd column is right here. We see it says inference/reasoning. We have a quote here. You need to tell your reader what that quote means and how it helps support your reasoning about what release is. You need to make that connection, your thought process. So if this is your reasoning, you're thinking about the quote about release, that information comes from your brain. Now, once again, we have this little box at the end used in your writing. I am going to ask you to make the claim this time. We will actually do these in class together, and I want to check them. You won't actually have to write out the support yet. We will get there where you are going to write out the answers, but I'm leaving that box there. Why are you gathering this information? What are you trying to figure out? Anytime you're in a discussion with somebody about what something is, your argument is going to be stronger when you have evidence and support. So we have not, unless you've already read the book, but we do not know truly what release is. So you need the support and the reasonings to support your ideas of what release would be. You have to be able to explain it with evidence. If you don't have that evidence, you're just randomly saying things, it's not going to be a strong argument, which is why we are practicing gathering this evidence. And we're trying to piece together what's happening in the book. How does this all fit together? We're trying to have a better understanding of this community and its strange ways. All right, underneath the chart, which I mentioned to you, I'm only going to go through chapter 4 today. But then once again, so we will now reread the chapter. Some of you may have read chapter 4 earlier this week. We're going to read it again to find the information. Listen carefully as the chapter is read aloud. Watch for information that will help you complete the graphic organizer. During the read aloud, every time you hear some evidence from the text that you think belongs on the chart, raise your hand. The class will stop to discuss what you've noticed and decide whether to add that evidence to the chart. Okay, so we will fill out the chart through the video. And then we will come back to number 4, write a claim. This is your topic sentence of your written answer, where you are, this is the claim. And then if you were to go on and answer the question, you would go back to the chart and support it with that evidence. We're going to go piece by piece, whereas all I'm going to ask you to put is that topic sentence. And if we have not already covered topic sentence strategies in class, please wait for me to do this so that we can discuss some proper ways to begin those answers. That's where we are going to start for chapter 4. And actually, I'm going to leave the chart up because if you remember correctly in that question for number 1, it tells you, the community is introduced on page 2. And then also in another place, those are our first 2 quotes. We're actually going to go back to chapters 1 and 2 before we even take a look at chapter 4. So I have my books handy. I'm going to put my cursor in here. And you may actually have a different page number than page 2, depending on your book. So in the hardcover books, it is page 2. It is the very last full paragraph. It says in there that it continues on to the next one, but if you have the yellow words, it does not continue. So I'm just going to reread that paragraph. Please have your book in front of you because we're not going to copy the entire paragraph into this box. We're going to pick out the best part that's going to help support release. So, I'm sorry. It is the very last full paragraph on page 2. I was thinking of the next quote. So we see in capital letters, the speaker talking. Needless to say, he will be released, the voice had said, followed by silence. There was an ironic tone to that final message, as if the speaker found it amusing, and Jonas had smiled a little, though he knew what a grim statement it had been. For a contributing citizen to be released from the community was a final decision, a terrible punishment, an overwhelming statement of failure. Now, it does technically go on as it describes some of the information about Jonas and Asher and joking about it, and connects it into precision of language. If we're in the classroom, we'll discuss, do we want to take something from in there, or do we think there's a sentence in this paragraph that would be best? Now let's think about just that one paragraph. The capital letters, needless to say, he will be released. Is that a good, strong quote to be able to share what it means to be released? Or is there something better in the paragraph? Yeah, that's really just an introduction into the idea of release. But if we go all the way down to the very last sentence, we start to get a little bit that we understand, not fully, but we understand a little bit more about what release might mean. So I'm going to put my quotation marks, because remember, it's not dialogue, but it's not my words. It's coming from the book. So I'm going to take that last sentence where it says, for a contributing citizen to be released from the community was a final decision. There's no coming back. A terrible punishment. An overwhelming statement of failure. So contributing citizen, that means somebody who is, working and helping out in the community. And now we get this idea that they have failed in some way and they are being released from the community. All right, so in this black book, this was on page 2. Whoops, my number lock must not be on. If you are in this book, which I meant to tell you this before I started to read, if we take, I think it's page 3. It is, and you can simply look for, the paragraph starts with capital letters, and we're looking at that very last sentence. You would put page 3, not page 2. If your book actually has that paragraph split, then wherever that sentence came from, if you use that sentence, if it's on both pages, 2 to 3, if it's only on 3, you get the idea. Now, I would encourage you to pause the video and explain your thoughts about this particular quote. Give me a sentence over here or 2 that helps explain what you think this means about release. What does that say release is? What do you think? Or we can get the other quotes and you can come back to these if you need a little bit of time to piece all 3 together. All right, so I'm going to go on to the next quote. In the question on the front, it tells us briefly in the last paragraph on page 7 onto page 8. So in the black book, mine is actually, this is the one I was talking about. It's the very last full paragraph on page 7. The other book, it may continue over. If you are in this book, we're a lot further along, and it's actually page 9. Okay, so we're looking for right, I'm looking to see if it actually is page 9. It is, I'm sorry, page 9, it'll start the very last one, it'll go on to page 10. Okay, that's why I missed it, because that's where it starts. It's the paragraph that starts with, there were only 2 occasions. So I'm going to read that paragraph to you, and we're going to try to pull out the quote for this next box. There were only 2 occasions of release which were not punishment. Release of the elderly, which was a time of celebration for a life well and fully lived, and release of a new child, which always brought a sense of what could we have done. This was especially troubling for the nurturers like father, who felt they had failed somehow, but it happened very rarely. So once again, we want to pick out the very best sentence from this paragraph that's going to give us some information about release. Now we get this topic sentence of the paragraph. There were only 2 occasions of release, which were not punishment. And that's a power number statement. We've got our number. There's 2 occasions. But do we learn much from that topic sentence? No, we get the evidence in the next one, and it's a compound sentence here with both ideas in it. We see release of the elderly, which was a time of celebration for a life well and fully lived, and release of a new child, which always brought a sense of what could we have done. That's probably going to be our very best sentence. So we're going to put this in here. I'm going to put my quotations again, not dialogue, but not my words, comes directly from the book. So I'm going to say release of the elderly, which was a time of celebration for a life well and fully lived. Semicolon makes this a compound sentence as I go into the next idea, and release of a new child, which always brought a sense of what could we have done. End quote. In this book, that came from page 7. Okay, now if you had this book, remember that paragraph started on page 9, but that sentence that I just quoted didn't start until page 10. So in that case, I would put page 10. All right. Now, once again, you need to think about, what does this mean about release? What happens with the elderly? What happens with the new child? What do you think this means for release? That this is not a terrible punishment, but that they are still being released from the community. Give your explanation of what you believe that that means. All right, and then once you have that, we are going to read chapter 4. We are looking for just one quote about Roberto's release. So I am going to change my share so that we go to chapter 4. Please, if we're in the classroom, raise your hand when you hear a quote that you think might work, and we'll discuss it at the end if we haven't already. Chapter 4. Jonas rode at a leisurely pace, glancing at the bike ports beside the buildings to see if he could spot Asher's. He didn't often do his volunteer hours with his friend because Asher frequently fooled around and made serious work a little difficult. But now, with 12 coming on so soon and the volunteer hours ending, it didn't seem to matter. The freedom to choose where to spend those hours had always seemed a wonderful luxury to Jonas. Other hours of the day were so carefully regulated. He remembered when he had become an 8, as Lily would do shortly, and had been faced with that freedom of choice. The 8s always set out on their first volunteer hour a little nervously, giggling and staying in groups of friends. They almost invariably did their hours on recreation duty first, helping with the younger ones in a place where they still felt comfortable. But with guidance, as they developed self-confidence and maturity, they moved on to other jobs, gravitating towards those that would suit their own interests and skills. A male 11 named Benjamin had done his entire nearly 4 years in the rehabilitation center, working with citizens who had been injured. It was rumored that he was skilled now as the rehabilitation directors themselves, and that he had even developed some machines and methods to hasten rehabilitation. There was no doubt that Benjamin would receive his assignment to that field and would probably be permitted to bypass most of the training. Jonas was impressed by the things Benjamin had achieved. He knew him, of course, since they had always been groupmates, but they had never talked about the boy's accomplishments because such a conversation would have been awkward for Benjamin. There was never any comfortable way to mention or discuss one's successes without breaking the rule against bragging, even if one didn't mean to. It was a minor rule, rather like rudeness, punishable only by gentle chastisement, but still better to steer clear of an occasion governed by a rule which would be so easy to break. The area of dwellings behind him, Jonas rode past the community structures, hoping to spot Asher's bicycle parked beside one of the small factories or office buildings. He passed the child care center where Lily stayed after school and the play area surrounding it. He rode through the central plaza and the large auditorium where public meetings were held. Jonas slowed and looked at the name tags on the bicycles lined up outside the nurturing center. Then he checked those outside food distribution. It was always fun to help with the deliveries, and he hoped he would find his friend there so that they could go together on the daily rounds, carrying the cartons of supplies into the dwellings of the community. But he finally found Asher's bicycle leaning as usual instead of upright in its port as it should have been at the house of the old. Oh, that's a little too big. There was only one other child's bicycle there, that of a female 11 named Fiona. Jonas liked Fiona. She was a good student, quiet and polite, but she had a sense of fun as well, and it didn't surprise him that she was working with Asher today. He parked his bicycle neatly in the port beside theirs and entered the building. "Hello, Jonas," the attendant at the front desk said. She handed him the sign-up sheet and stamped her own official seal beside his signature. All of his volunteer hours would be carefully tabulated at the Hall of Open Records. Once, long ago, it was whispered among the children, and 11 had arrived at the ceremony of 12, only to hear a public announcement that he had not completed the required number of volunteer hours and would not, therefore, be given his assignment. He had been permitted an additional month in which to complete the hours, and then given his assignment privately, with no applause, no celebration, a disgrace that had clouded his entire future. "It's good to have some volunteers here today," the attendant told him. "We celebrated a release this morning, and that always throws the schedule off a little, so things get backed up." She looked at a printed sheet. "Let's see. Asher and Fiona are helping in the bathing room. Why don't you join them there? You know where it is, don't you?" All right, so she mentions that there was a release in the morning, but have we learned anything? Other than the fact that it throws off the schedule? No, so we're not going to take that as our quote. Let's keep reading. Jonas nodded, thanked her, and walked down the long hallway. He glanced into the rooms on either side. The old were sitting quietly, some visiting and talking with one another, others doing handwork and simple crafts. A few were asleep. Each room was comfortably furnished, the floors covered with thick carpeting. It was a serene and slow-paced place, unlike the busy centers of manufacture and distribution where the daily work of the community occurred. Jonas was glad that he had, over the years, chosen to do his hours in a variety of places so that he could experience the differences. He realized, though, that not focusing on one area meant he was left with not the slightest idea, not even a guess of what his assignment would be. He laughed softly, thinking about the ceremony again. Jonas, he teased himself, but he suspected that with the date so near, probably all of his friends were too. He passed a caretaker, walking slowly with one of the old in the hallway. "Hello, Jonas," the young uniformed man said, smiling pleasantly. The woman beside him, whose arm he held, was hunched over as she shuffled along in her soft slippers. She looked toward Jonas and smiled, but her dark eyes were clouded and blank. He realized she was blind. He entered the bathing room with its warm, moist air and scent of cleansing lotions. He removed his tunic, hung it carefully on a wall hook, and put on the volunteer's smock that was folded on a shelf. "Hi, Jonas," Asher called from the corner where he was kneeling beside a tub. Jonas saw Fiona nearby at a different tub. She looked up and smiled at him, but she was busy gently washing a man who lay in the warm water. Jonas greeted them and the caretaking attendants at work nearby. Then he went to the row of padded lounging chairs where the other old were waiting. He had worked here before. He knew what to do. "Your turn, Larissa," he said, reading the name tag on the woman's robe. "I'll just start the water and then help you up." He pressed the button on a nearby empty tub and watched as the warm water flowed in through the many small openings on the sides. The tub would be filled in a minute and the water flow would stop automatically. He helped the woman from the chair, led her to the tub, removed her robe, and steadied her with his hand on her arm as she stepped in and lowered herself. She leaned back and sighed with pleasure, her head on a soft, cushioned headrest. "Comfortable?" he asked, and she nodded, her eyes closed. Jonas squeezed cleansing lotion onto the clean sponge at the edge of the tub and began to wash her frail body. Last night, he had watched as his father bathed the new child. This was much the same. The fragile skin, the soothing water, the gentle motion of his hand slippery with soap. The relaxed, peaceful smile on the woman's face reminded him of Gabriel being bathed. And the nakedness, too. It was against the rules for children or adults to look at another's nakedness, but the rule did not apply to new children or the old. Jonas was glad. It was a nuisance to keep oneself covered while changing for games, and the required apology if one had by mistake glimpsed another's body was always awkward. He couldn't see why it was necessary. He liked the feeling of safety here in this warm and quiet room. He liked the expression of trust on the woman's face as she lay in the water, unprotected, exposed, and free. From the corner of his eye, he could see his friend Fiona help the old man from the tub and tenderly pat his thin, naked body with an absorbent cloth. She helped him into his robe. Jonas thought Larissa had drifted into sleep, as the old often did, and he was careful to keep his motions steady and gentle so he wouldn't wake her. He was surprised when she spoke, her eyes still closed. "This morning, we celebrated the release of Roberto," she told him. "It was wonderful." "I knew Roberto," Jonas said. "I helped him with his feeding the last time I was here, just a few weeks ago. He was a very interesting man." Larissa opened her eyes happily. "They told his whole life before they released him," she said. "They always do. But to be honest," she whispered with a mischievous look, "some of the tellings are a little boring. I've even seen some of the old fall asleep during tellings. When they released Edna recently," "Did you know Edna?" Jonas shook his head. He couldn't recall anyone named Edna. "Well, they tried to make her life sound meaningful. And of course," she added primly, "all lives are meaningful. I don't mean that they aren't, but Edna, my goodness, she was a birth mother, and then she worked in food production for years until she came here. She never even had a family unit." Larissa lifted her head and looked around to make sure no one else was listening. Then she confided, "I don't think Edna was very smart." Jonas laughed. He rinsed her left arm, laid it back into the water, and began to wash her feet. She murmured with pleasure as he massaged her feet with the sponge. "But Roberto's life was wonderful," Larissa went on. "After a moment, he had been an instructor of 11s, and you know how important that is. And he'd been on the planning committee. And goodness, I don't know how he found the time. He also raised 2 very successful children, and he was also the one who did the landscaping design for the Central Plaza. He didn't do the actual labor, of course." "Now you're back. Lean forward and I'll help you sit up." Jonas put his arm around her and supported her as she sat. He squeezed the sponge against her back and began to rub her sharp, boned shoulders. "Tell me about the celebration." "Well, there was the telling of his life. That is always first. Then the toast. We all raised our glasses and cheered. We chanted the anthem. He made a lovely goodbye speech. And several of us made little speeches wishing him well. I didn't, though. I've never been very fond of public speaking." "He was thrilled. You should have seen the look on his face when they let him go." Jonas slowed the strokes of his hand on her back thoughtfully. "Larissa," he asked, "what happens when they make the actual release? Where exactly did Roberto go?" She lifted her bare, wet shoulders in a small shrug. "I don't know. I don't think anybody does, except the committee. He just bowed to all of us and then walked, like they all do, through the special door in the releasing room. But you should have seen his look. Pure happiness, I'd call it." Jonas grinned. "I wish I'd been there to see it." Larissa frowned. "I don't know why they don't let children come." "Not enough room, I guess." "They should enlarge the releasing room." "We'll have to suggest that to the committee. Maybe they'll study it," Jonas said slyly, and Larissa chortled with laughter. "Right," she hooted, and Jonas helped her from the tub. Now, I didn't pause in the video if you were raising your hands. this whole page gives a description of Roberto's release. And truly, there are many different things that you can pick out. I don't know what your thought process is at the moment as far as what you think release means. You can pick things from the process. And one thing I do want to show you, let me go in here. Let's say you pick a long quote. Let's say, okay, I just need to find it in this book. All right, I'm on page 32. Okay, let's say you go into that paragraph where you say there's the telling of his life. Let's say you're going through the celebration. All right, so I am going to do the quotations. Don't steal this, take this quote unless you really, really want it. I'm going to talk about others, but I'm going to actually shorten it. I'm just going to say there was the, okay. Obviously, you want to have a complete thought within there. But then let's say you want to leave out the middle part until you get to, like you should have seen the look on his face when they let him go. If you want to take out middle part of the quote, but you want more of it, you want this beginning and the end, you can do what's called an ellipses. And that is when you see the 3 periods in a row, okay? And what those mean is that there's other information here, but I'm not providing it. Okay, so that is something else you can do. And then you kind of finish up your quotes and you have your quotation marks at the end, put the page or pages that it came from. All right, I'm going to stop the share. I'm going to go back to some of the other things that we see on page 32. So you might talk about the process. You might get into her answer when he asks, where did he go? Because that's the biggest question. What really happened? So that was the ceremony, but now what happens after? And we realize that she doesn't really know either, but that there is a releasing room. So perhaps you want to mention that they go through the special door into the releasing room, and then you can make your own inferences and guesses as far as either what happens in that room or what happens after they go into that room. That is your own thought process. Now, for some of you, this is going to be a little tricky because perhaps you have already read this book because it's a good one and you may have read it before you got to me, or perhaps you have seen the movie because that did come out a few years ago. So I want you to be a little careful in how you approach this. I would love for you to think about what you were thinking before you finished the book as you were reading the process and try to support it in that way. If you do know the answer and you just want to support what you believe you know the answer is, that is fine, but do me a favor and don't tell other people. Let everyone in class figure it out for themselves. And I do want to warn you about the movie because it is very, very different. So that we will watch it once we finish the book and we will discuss all these similarities and differences. Do not count on that movie getting you through this unit because there's going to be a lot of information that's incorrect based on what we're doing. You have to read this with me. All right, at another time, we will write our claim. Please finish the quote and your thought processes for the quotes that go along with chapter 4, and then we will see each other for chapter 5.